Hi everyone, welcome to our multi-heart lecture series. We're starting today the new year with Dr. Sadir Al-Kindi from Houston Methodist, who will be speaking about the heart of the matter, environmental determinants of cardiometabolic disease. It's a real great pleasure to have Dr. Kindi here. He received his MD from Weill Cornell Medical College in Qatar. He went to complete his residency in internal medicine and fellowships in cardiovascular medicine and imaging at university hospitals from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. He then served as a co-director for the Cardiometabolic Center and as a staff cardiologist there at university hospitals. And in 2023, he moved to Houston Methodist, the Baker Heart and Vascular Center, where he practices today. So clinically, Dr. Al-Kindi serves as a preventive and imaging cardiologist, and where he is the associate director for the Division of Cardiovascular Prevention and Wellness, and a member of the cardiovascular imaging faculty at Houston Methodist. Dr. Al-Kindi focuses on using advanced imaging to guide therapeutic interventions to reduce risk. Dr. Al-Kindi is an active clinical and translational researcher with over 200 peer-reviewed publications in top journals such as JACC, Circulation, European Heart Journal, and JAMA Cardiology. His research has focused on understanding the underpinnings of cardiovascular disease and novel methods to identify risk and precision cardiovascular prevention. He also focuses on environmental determinants of cardiovascular disease, social determinants of health, cardiometabolic disease, and advanced cardiovascular imaging. He's the Associate Director for the Center for Cardiovascular Computational and Precision Health at the DeBakey Heart and Vascular Center. So an amazing researcher in an amazing center. So we're really looking forward to your lecture. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for the kind invitation and the introduction. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. 1 second. Okay. So it is my pleasure to present to you today, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you so much for the attendance and for the invitation. Today I'll talk about something that is really not talked about so much in clinical cardiology or throughout my training or our training in general, clinical training. And although it's becoming more and more realized and recognized, it still is under-recognized from a clinical perspective. And this is something that hopefully by the end of the presentation, I'll convince you that it's actually much bigger than we thought. So the title of the talk, as you can see, this is an image on the right side that's generated by AI, as you can tell from the rubbish, kind of the made up words, but it kind of captures a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today. And it's really, it's a mesh network of things that can drive cardiovascular disease and cardiometabolic health. So I have no relevant disclosure to this talk, but the objectives of my talk is we're going to summarize some clinical and epi research that links air pollution and other environmental pollutants to metabolic risks. We'll discuss the potential mechanisms a little bit with that links environmental exposures with cardiometabolic risk, and outline mitigation strategies to reduce exposure and risks, and from individual healthcare and societal standpoint. And I'll try to preface this by saying that what we've been taught in medical school to be deterministic, right? We look at, okay, high cholesterol leads to heart disease, obesity leads to diabetes, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the data that, humans are actually very different from each other, but also environments are very different from each other. And if you watch Netflix, you'll see that this amazing kind of documentary / series where they talk about these areas called blue zones throughout the world where people consistently live above 100 years old. So what is really special about these areas? And these areas actually sit adjacent to some other areas that don't have this increased life expectancy. So there's something about, it's not just genetic, and we know that from multiple studies about polygenic risk scores that they describe very, very small percentage of the variance from individual to individual. And it's not really related to risk factors that much. So there's something about environments, there's something about these neighborhoods that really can drive risk, drive cardiometabolic risk. And there may be something beyond what we study in medical school that is deterministic, that maybe related to neighborhoods. So if you were to, this is a study from the Global Burden of Disease that looks at, kind of ranks the risk factors. And this is what we know so far, and kind of ranks the risk factors in terms of their impact on global mortality. And you can see things that kind of make sense to us: high blood pressure, tobacco, dietary. But then one of the important things that comes out is air pollution. And air pollution is the fourth most important risk factor for overall cardiovascular mortality in the world. And it's actually the most important environmental risk factor. So we'll spend some time talking about air pollution specifically, but think about it as a prototype for the others, or kind of a prime example of all other environmental risk factors. So as you know, every few years, the American Heart Association comes out with these things where we call them Life Essential or Life Simple. Used to be called Life Simple 7, and more recently, in 2022, they came out with American Heart Association Life Essential 8, and kind of expanded it to include sleep, but also this framework here that includes maintaining your weight, maintaining your sugar levels, and exercise, and all that stuff. And they weaved it into this social determinants of health, which is really impressive to think about social determinants of health as impactful for cardiometabolic health and cardiovascular health. But also, I would go a step further and I would say that they did, there is something that we should really expand to. Although social determinants of health are extremely important, I would think about this concept of the exposome. So exposome comes from exposure and omics, and you can think about from a conceptual framework, you can think about three components of the exposome. There's the personal exposome, and this is what your physical activity is, your diet, your work, your exposures at work, and so on and so forth. But there's the external exposome, things that, for the most part, things that are neighborhood related or environment related. So urban environment, air pollution, climate, green space, and these are just examples: light pollution and traffic pollution. And how do these two things interact with each other is important, because, for example, if you have traffic pollution or light pollution, that may impact your sleep, and having bad sleep can impact your susceptibility to air pollution, and so on and so forth. But also importantly, how do these interact with the biologic responses? And this is where polygenics and genomics and epigenomics, metabolomics, and how do these interact with each other to kind of interact with the external and the personal exposome. So thinking about an exposomic framework for cardiometabolic health becomes important, and kind of broadening our thinking with respect to understanding health and disease. So this is an example of what really impacts urban or cardiometabolic health in urban environments. And you can see that on the left side, you see the part of the puzzle is the cardiometabolic CKM, call it whatever you want to call it, kind of the spectrum of disease or phenotypes. And then on the right side, you see some of the things that are weaved into the urban environment that can impact disease. And they really are all full part of the full picture of cardiometabolic health. And I would urge you to think about reading this paper that we put together. It's a state-of-the-art review in Circulation that just came out, that really deals with individual components of this and kind of thinks about an exposome framework for cardiometabolic health. And this is just a list of things that can really impact and has been linked with their cardiometabolic health. And I'm not going to go through them, but also think of social, ecosystems, lifestyle, and physical, chemical. And this is just to give you a different conceptual framework that talks about the exposome from slightly different lens. All right. So, okay, so that's all great. We showed you some, cross-sectional. I showed you some rhetoric kind of stories from Netflix, but the question is, we always talk about data. So what is really the data, and how can we separate the environment from the individual susceptibility, individual kind of characteristics? And I'll show you a couple of studies that really kind of gives you a flavor of how can we prove or get closer to causality that neighborhoods can impact health. This is the first one, which is a longitudinal retrospective study from the Veteran Affairs Hospital. And as you know, the VA has been a pioneer in EHR, so they have data going back, decades. on individuals, and they have good attribution of individuals and adjudication of outcomes and so on and so forth. So what they've done, this list of authors here, they asked a simple question. If a person moves from one neighborhood to another neighborhood that has different characteristics, like say they have higher rates of uncontrolled blood pressure or higher rates of uncontrolled diabetes or higher rates of suicide or depression or obesity, does that individual maintain their original kind of phenotype, or do they adapt to the new neighborhood phenotype? And you can see that this is time zero where people move, and you can see that what happens is as people move, they adapt to the new neighborhood. So if you come from a neighborhood that, if you move to a neighborhood that has higher prevalence of uncontrolled hypertension, then your prevalence of uncontrolled hypertension becomes higher, or the unadjusted rate. Same thing goes with diabetes. If you move to an area that has higher rates of uncontrolled diabetes, then you're more likely to become uncontrolled in terms of diabetes. Same thing with obesity and same thing with depression. All right. So again, this is great. This is national. This is kind of longitudinal, but it's still retrospective. The best evidence that we have right now is from a randomized controlled trial, which to me, this is one of the uh, most intelligent randomized trials, most important ones. And this is actually a randomized trial that ran in the 90s, where the Department of Housing and Urban Development had randomized approximately 4,500 women and children. These individuals live in high poverty census tracts, as defined by more than 40% of the residents live in below the federal poverty levels. And they said, okay, we're going to randomize you to three groups. One group, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to follow you up and get your A1C and weight and height in a few years. The other one, we're going to say, I'm going to give you a housing voucher, but you can do whatever you want with it. You want to stay and use it for paying rent in your neighborhood, that's great, up to you. And then the other one, the other arm, which is really, I'm going to only give you a housing voucher if you move from your neighborhood, which has high poverty, to a low poverty group. And they followed patients, these are women and children, for incidence of obesity and A1C changes indicative of diabetes. And what you can see is over 5 to 10 years, and I'm going to just show you the control and the low poverty voucher, there was a significant reduction in obesity, severe obesity, and significant reduction in diabetes. So this is in a randomized fashion. Yes, it's cluster randomization. Yes, it's fraught with some issues. But again, this shows you in a randomized causal framework that really we can change people's risk of obesity and diabetes if we change their neighborhoods. So this is as close as it gets to causality. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk, spend a few slides talking about air pollution. And like I said before, air pollution is the most studied, most important environmental risk factor. But think of it as an example of other environmental factors. When we talk about air pollution, we talk about solid and gas. Solid is these particulate matter, and we measure them by their size. So we have the tiny ones that are ultrafine, less than 0.1, and then the fine ones, which are less than 2.5 micrometer, and then the coarse one, which is 2.5 and to 10. And these are primarily has been studied for health. Fine particulate matter is probably the most important one right now, although we're moving a little bit towards ultrafines. The smaller the molecule or the smaller the particle, the more likely it is to be absorbed into circulation because it can cross the lung blood barrier. But that's also problematic to measure because there is significant temporal, time-related, and spatial, location-related changes that make it difficult to measure. So it's kind of chaotic and so on and so forth. So that's why fine particulate matter is probably the one that we kind of think about for the most part for air pollution. And there is gaseous types of air pollutants, including ozone and O2, sulfur dioxide, and others that are also have been linked with cardiovascular disease, but most of the work that I'm going to show you has been really around fine particulate matter. So if you think about the size, just to give you a perspective of what the size is, hair is approximately 100 micrometers. A cell, a PMN is about 10, so that's where the limit of PM10 is. And PM2.5 is approximately the size of an RBC cell. And if you looking globally, there is significant variation in air pollution levels. And these are kind of models that are deriving data from satellites and combining them with other statistical and ground monitors and so on and so forth. And we're lucky that we live in this part of the world where we have very little air pollution. But I'll show you data to suggest that even very little is bad. But there are areas where, so for example, in the United States, the levels are 7, 8, 9 microgram per meter cube on average, annual average. But there are areas in the world, especially North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, where the levels are really high. And you can see the annual average in Bangladesh is 80, so tenfold compared with the United States. But on some days, this can exceed 500 sometimes. That's why you get really bad air pollution days where you have to kind of wear masks and so on and so forth. But why is it important to think about the low air pollution as well? Because it turns out that the relationship between air pollution, and this is from multiple mega meta-analyses, the relationship is probably curvilinear, suggesting that the relative risk for cardiovascular disease is, as it relates to concentration of PM2.5, increases dramatically in the low air pollution levels, and then kind of plateaus afterwards. So that tells us that the changes here, even between 0 and 10, are steep. The relationship is very steep. That changes here may be even more dramatic than changing from 120 to 100, where you are still in the very high limit in the plateau phase. And the same thing holds for incidence of diabetes. So this is incidence of diabetes relationship, also somewhat curvilinear relationship. And again, in the low levels, we have a steep relationship. All right. The patients that we treat in the clinic and in the hospital, they're probably more susceptible, meaning that if you get exposed to the same effect, the same levels of air pollution, if you have pre-existing cardiovascular disease, you have significantly higher risk of cardiovascular mortality and other things. This is a study that we did using the VA data set, approximately 70,000 veterans, and we took patients who had received PCI, elective PCI for their coronary artery disease, and we assigned them PM2.5 exposures. And as you can see, the levels here are low compared with what I've showed you, right? So, a lot of the country lives in less than 5, but some areas in the country live in, there's 9 to 16. And I would just remind you that the WHO, the World Health Organization, limits annual exposure to 5 microgram per meter cube. So, and this is work that shows that if you look at patients, if they're exposed to higher air pollution compared with lower air pollution, meaning that as compared with the ideal, less than 5, then you lose approximately 2 years of your life expectancy if you have a PCI at 50 years, if you live in a high area of high pollution compared with low pollution. So just air pollution can have a significant impact. Again, this is a retrospective study, but have a significant association with with mortality and survival over time. This is a complex figure, but just to show you that a lot of these mechanisms, this is not just an epidemiologic cross-sectional studies, but a lot of these mechanisms are actually worked up in mouse studies and randomized human studies that are no longer ethical to do. And also there are a lot of molecular and cellular level analyses that have shown that PM2.5 have an impact. The question remains is really how does a particle that may not get absorbed in the blood lead to significant impact on the heart? And it turns out that there are, initiating mechanisms and potentially some intermediate mechanisms that lead to effects. And just to summarize this in a conceptual framework, we think that particles get inhaled, they go into the lungs, they can cause 3 different intermediate mechanisms. And these are oxidative stress that happens in the lung. you get some direct translocation. So you get some translocation of the ultrafine particles, which are part of the PM2.5. And then you get some biologic intermediates, including interleukins and other cytokines that can go and impact the body. And this leads to effector mechanisms, including autonomic imbalance, endothelial dysfunction, HPA axis activation, inflammation, and thrombosis, which are all associated with and lead to cardiometabolic disease. Again, on the right side of this is talking about metabolic, and you can see that there is the effects of PM2.5 are vast throughout the immune system, the adipose tissue, the liver, muscle, brain, and brown adipose tissue. And if you look at mice that are exposed to air pollution in a controlled fashion, the experiments showed that there is a vast changes that happen across multiple organs, epigenetic changes that lead to changes in gene transcriptions and other things that have significant impact, but also overlap significantly with other stressors, including high-fat diet. So there's a significant overlap with things that we are familiar with, including high-fat diet that is usually used as a stressor for cardiovascular health in mice. Another switching gears a little bit and talking about other pollutants that may have impact but also understudied is noise. Noise is measured in decibels. That's audible decibels, and you can see that a lot of things that we're exposed to, including passenger car, if you drive, or telephone ringing, or other things, are above the healthy limit. And indirect non-auditory health effects of the noise can lead to stress, disturbance of sleep, annoyance, and that can increase stress levels, catecholamines, oxidative stress, and also inflammation that manifests in disease. And this is, if you look at studies, multiple studies have shown this relationship, but the hazard ratio for ischemic heart disease is flat in the beginning, and then above that unhealthy limit, which is around 60, is where you start seeing a significant increase in hazard ratios, and the same thing happens for stroke. In randomized trials, these are field randomized trials performed by my colleagues in Germany. You can see that these are simulated noise exposures versus no noise exposure. You can see that there is an impact on endothelial function, blood pressure, restfulness, quality of life, and sleep quality, all of which have been linked with cardiovascular disease. And not only that, but they seem to be also interacting and independent also from air pollution. And this is a study that was published last year that looked at the UK Biobank and showed that increase in air in noise, road traffic noise, can be associated with increased risk for hypertension diagnoses independently of air pollution levels. Not only air pollution is important, but also food environment is important. And this is another study showing that food environment can be associated with cardiovascular disease, and they can interact with income inequality to result in increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So here is a complex figure that shows you food environment index, which is a composite index of how available the food is to you. And then this is income inequality measure. And you can see that red is bad, blue is good. And you can see that as you decrease your food environment index, and as you increase your income inequality, both of them are interacting at the high level that result in significant cardiovascular disease. All right, so too much change is not a good thing, and we'll talk without, there is not enough talk, not a good talk about environment without talking about the climate. And climate change is complex because it involves multiple avenues, multiple components, and things like that. But I'll just spend a brief slide here talking about temperature changes, which are very critical, turns out, for cardiovascular health. And using the global burden of disease study, we show that changes in temperature, both hot and cold temperatures, are associated with significant increase in cardiovascular disease. And it's estimated approximately 1.2 million cardiovascular deaths happen in the world these days because of either low temperature or high temperature. And that number is increasing given the aging population and more urbanization, and adding to that changes in temperature and climate change. So this is going to be a complex issue that needs to be addressed in the future. All right. So how does climate change impact cardiovascular disease? And it's multiple mechanisms, but in general, climate change is caused by fossil fuel utilization and maybe other things on top of it as well, which can lead to extreme temperatures, altered meteorology, and also weather events, all of which can result in cardiovascular sequelae through damage to healthcare infrastructure, wildfires, which can increase air pollutants, and climate penalty, which can also increase air pollutants, and then ozone, which can by itself lead to heart disease and heart attacks and other things. But more at the physiologic level, both hot and cold temperature have been shown to change the physiology and by altering hemoconcentration and coagulability, increasing cardiac output, for example, for heat, vasoconstriction, especially for patients who have heart disease or heart failure, and that leads to tachycardia, sympathetic activation, and other things. And the same thing happens for hot and cold, but the opposite direction. And both of them can be impactful, a significant impact that can lead to cardiovascular disease. There's also other things, for example, on cold days, you may have disruption in healthcare services and or the availability of ambulance and things like that. Also change in physical activity, fluid intake, and clothing that can also be contributing factors. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but just realize that there is also basic science that's been studied about this and how does the neutrophil and the monocyte activation can lead to cardiovascular disease and can be modulated by heat exposure. All right. The built environment is a big thing that has been understudied. Most studies that I've showed you, because you can quantify. You can quantify PM 2.5. You can quantify temperature. But the built environment, all of us realize that if you have a walkable neighborhood, if you have temperature, if you have green space and things like that, and if you just the architecture of the city may have an impact. So the built environment, and how can we leverage data science to understand this? So this is some work that we kind of put out recently that looked at remote sensing techniques. So looking globally at in the United States, and this is just an example from 7 cities, but you can see that we take Google satellite images and Google Street View images and really use state-of-the-art AI models to extract features from these. And then we train models to predict the prevalence of cardiovascular disease. So here it shows you on the x-axis that features that are extracted from this are associated with the risk of coronary heart disease prevalence. Each dot here is a neighborhood or a census tract. And on the top figure, I'm showing you coronary disease. In the middle one, I'm showing you chronic kidney disease. And the bottom one is stroke. And you can see that there is a tight relationship between what's observed and what's predicted by the model. And we have an accuracy of approximately between 60 and 65%. So meaning that 60 and 65% of the differences between the neighborhoods in terms of prevalence of cardiovascular disease can be explained by just some stuff that we see on these images or what the AI is seeing on these images. And this is not only at the ecologic space, but also in the individual space. And you can see here we took about 50,000 individuals and we showed that you can derive a score using these satellite images. All we need is their address. And we can derive a score, and that score, GSI score, Google Satellite Image Score, can risk stratify patients with respect to incident MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, over follow-up time. You probably are familiar with this paper that got published recently about micro and nanoplastics, and that's another component of the environment where it's also been understudied, but this study will fuel a lot of other studies to look into this. And what basically the authors looked in Italy looked at atheromas that are removed from CEA carotid endarterectomies from patients and showed that there is nanoplastics that you can identify in the atheroma near and inside macrophages. And these are associated with increased risk for major adverse cardiovascular events. So what does it mean? What is the source? How can we minimize it? This is all still yet to be investigated and have implications for healthcare. So just thinking about the exposome in general, the exposome is a life course. It's across life spectrum, and There's data that suggests that even intrauterine or embryo exposure can lead to changes in cardiovascular health throughout life. So if you think about it, I mean, we have this gap, which could be an equity gap, it could be an environmental justice gap of those individuals who live healthier than others and live longer compared with individuals that die early with more disease, more comorbidities. And if you look at the life course from embryo to senior adulthood, with the kind of cardiovascular risk factor development and cardiovascular events, you see that there is areas, this is conceptual, but these are adverse exposome. Individuals who live in adverse exposome will have shorter life with more comorbidities compared with individuals who live in healthy exposome. So it's a life course kind of framework. And not when we think about exposome, we think about bad, we think about air pollution, we think about noise pollution and things like that. But just realize that there is a beneficial part of the exposome, and that could be leading to stress resilience, circadian synchronicity, and immunoredox balance. And I'll show you some examples of this. This is an example of work that we've done looking nationally at walkability of the neighborhood and how does it relate to cardiovascular disease. And you can see that nationally throughout approximately 60,000 neighborhoods, the more walkable the neighborhood is, the less prevalence of bad stuff, whether hypertension, cholesterol, obesity, diabetes, and coronary artery disease. So that is something that needs to be looked at a little bit closer and whether this is modifiable or not. And green spaces, there's a lot of studies that show that green space access is linked with cardiovascular morbidity, less cardiovascular morbidity, less ischemic heart disease morbidity, and stroke morbidity, and so on and so forth. I'm gonna skip this for a second, but just realize that there's complexity to this issue because it turns out that not in these areas, if you look at there's a method called geospatial weighting, where you look at individual areas in the United States and see what is the most important factor that's impacting mortality or associated with mortality or cardiovascular disease. And it's not uniform. So there are areas where education is really leading or associated strongly with cardiovascular disease. There's areas where you have hot pockets of food insecurity that are associated, more strongly associated. And there are areas that have air pollution or income or primary care access and things like that. So there's a lot of complexities that we're only scratching the surface about. I'm going to skip these two slides, but just realize that there is a lot of things that have been worked out with respect to multiple exposures, whether it's air pollution, light pollution, and how does it lead to, mechanistic approaches and things like that. And if you're interested, there's a couple of papers, the state-of-the-art reviews in JACC Advances that came out recently that deals with this. I'll refer you to them. Okay, so that's all great. Whenever I give talks like this, I get a kind of questions from clinicians like, "Oh, how is that related to how I practice medicine?" So I'm going to give you three different lenses: an individual lens from patient and clinician, a healthcare lens, and a societal lens on how to achieve better care and reduce that environmental justice gap. So this is a Lancet paper that was published a few years ago that talks about obesity, but it's just, you can think of it as applicable to really any cardiometabolic disease. And it gives you a more comprehensive, more holistic approach to obesity, because obesity, although we try to treat it in the clinic, it's really not just a physician problem or a patient problem. It's a societal problem. It's a policy problem. So these are kind of different views. There is a global outcomes view where you can think about natural systems all the way from microsystems to natural systems. You can think of it as a global syndemic view where you have multiple stakeholders and you have multiple feedback loop mechanisms. There is a feedback loop view where it's really focused from a feedback mechanism where you have a health loop, a business loop, an ecologic loop. And then you have an individual view where you talk about, whether it's the walker, the voter, the customer. And these are kind of different perspectives on how to understand obesity syndemics in the current world. So from an individual standpoint, we have been taught in medical school and residency for the most part, that we ought to look at the organ that we're treating, right? So it could be something related to the heart or the cells of the heart or the myocytes or the atheromas or the arteries and things like that. And in the past few decades, maybe more than a few decades, we started to recognize that risk factors are important. So these are healthy diet, and I'm sure in the beginning, when people were talking about physical activity, people thought that this is crazy. I mean, who cares about physical activity? We're seeing atheromas. How is that related to this? But more and more evidence started to build up, and these now became the new pillars of cardiometabolic health to understand as drivers. And more recently, we started to think about residual risk, right? So you see patients who have controlled lipids or controlled thrombosis, but also they have residual risk. And we started to think about residual inflammatory risk and residual thrombotic risk. But I would say I would go a step further beyond that, and I introduced this residual socio-environmental risk. And this is something that we don't think about in the clinic, although this is critically important. And perhaps you may argue in certain individuals, this is even more important than all of this included, because it's the proximate determinant of health. So think about in your patients, residual social risk, residual environmental risk, how can we intervene upon those? All right, something that would be important for the clinicians. Why do we need to care about the environment, and why do we need to care about environmental hazards? It turns out this is a study that we did looking at the SPRINT trial. As you know, SPRINT trial randomized patients who have an increased risk for cardiovascular disease to intensive lowering of blood pressure versus regular lowering of blood pressure, and looked at incident cardiovascular events. And what we said, we asked a simple question. We said, does exposure to air pollution, or does where you live impact your benefit that you get out of the intensive treatment compared with the standard treatment? And what we did is we took almost all patients in SPRINT, and we assigned them air pollution according to their residential address. And we looked at the outcomes by intensive or standard by their exposure. And the cutoff that we used was 12, because this is the EPA cutoff for annual exposure for PM 2.5. And you can see, this is impressive here, you can see that if you live in an area that has high pollution, you derive a stronger relative benefit, but also stronger absolute benefit with intensive lowering of blood pressure compared with those who still derive some benefit, but less impressive benefit if you live in an area that is healthy. So that's a step towards thinking about environment intervention or environment medical intervention interactions. And we have work that will be presented in AHA this year that looked at similar concept with finerenone, which is a non-steroidal mineralocorticoid antagonist. I will refer you to this AHA statement because it really is important to understand personal level protective actions. And sometimes this is important outside the United States more than in the United States, but maybe areas where you have a lot of wildfires in New York. I know you guys got a lot of smoke from wildfires in Canada, and this is unfortunately becoming a recurrent event that we are predicting that will worsen. But there are multiple components, but probably the most important one is really personal or portable air cleaners. And then with some exceptions, N95 for high-risk individuals, and I'll talk about this in a second. But there's a clinical applicable kind of framework to understand, how can you deal with environmental exposures throughout. This is a global perspective to think about patients with cardiovascular or cardiometabolic comorbidities and what to do to reduce their risk. Interestingly, there are a lot of sham-controlled randomized trials of portable air cleaners with high-efficiency filters, HEPAs, that showed that if you, even in the United States where the levels are really not that bad, and even indoor pollution, if you provide individuals with portable air cleaners, they reduce their systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. And the results are, they're good. We're talking about very low cost, very low intervention, very kind of very low touch intervention. And it shows that in a sham controlled fashion, you can reduce air pollution by about 50 to 60% overall, and you can show a significant reduction in systolic blood pressure. think about this in a population. Although this on the individual scale is small, but at the population level, this can lead to significant impact in cardiovascular disease. We're running an interventional trial in an area in the Middle East where you have a lot of air pollution exposure, but that's something that hopefully we'll get the results soon about metabolic disease, patients with cardiometabolic syndrome. And we want to see, first of all, what is the impact of active filtration using indoor portable air cleaners as compared with sham filtration using a crossover design, and what is really the mechanisms using multiomics. And from a personal mitigation of air pollution, you think about home air filtrations, personal face masks, specifically N95, that are designed to reduce particulate matter. But also there are some behavioral things, whether it's exercise that can mitigate the risk, but not exercising when the environment is polluted. So exercise during polluted environments or in the polluted environments may actually be harmful. There's some data about dietary supplements still emerging that counteract oxidative stress that's caused by PM2.5, and obviously staying indoors because indoor air pollution, at least in the United States, is usually much lower than outdoor air pollution. Okay, so we talked about the individual lens. Let's talk about the healthcare lens. And it's no surprise that healthcare is the major pollutant, is a major pollutant for the environment. And you can see all the stuff that is on daily basis. We throw out so much plastic, so much single-use stuff. And if you think about air pollution from healthcare, if healthcare was a country, all of healthcare in the world was a country, it would be one of the top 5 polluters in the world. So think about that for a second. And the US, only the US, contributes to 25% of greenhouse gas or carbon footprint of healthcare related in the world, healthcare related emissions. And we think about different scopes of air pollutant, of environmental kind of footprint or carbon footprint from healthcare, but a lot of them are related to gas and electricity, manufacturing, and agriculture and pharmaceuticals and chemicals that we utilize, but also transportation and waste management. And you can see that the sources, this is also some kind of conceptual framework, so to speak, or kind of a small review looking at what are some of the sources. In cardiology, because we use a lot of devices, we use a lot of imaging, we use, and cardiovascular disease is the most common cause of cardiovascular mortality, of mortality and morbidity in the US, at least, and globally, then it's no surprise that cardiology and cardiovascular services are major pollutants of the environment. And you can see that the sources are between transportation for patient and staff, pharmaceuticals, food, even food, whether it's inpatient or outpatient food services, energy use, of course, for cath lab. You go to the cath lab and it's freezing. You go to the OR, it's freezing. This is all energy that's contributing to fossil fuel use in the environment. And then also medical devices. You throw out a lot of stents and devices that are single-use catheters and also single-use disposable devices. Some of the solutions, it's complex, but of course, some of the solutions is we really need system thinking. We need clinicians to be involved in sustainability efforts throughout the hospital. We need to understand how one thing can lead to another and how we can break that cycle by studying causal loop diagrams. We need culture change. We need maybe some competitions at the hospital level or between hospitals. Prevention of cardiovascular disease is critical. If you prevent cardiovascular disease, you lead to less cardiovascular procedures and less utilization of cardiovascular health issues, and then so on and so forth that can impact. And of course, policy changes. How can we intervene on social determinants of health, advocacy, and maybe we can incorporate this within a framework of cost saving and ranking and quality improvement and so on and so forth. And this is a framework to understand how can we reduce in the cath lab, for example. So think about if you want to take something out of this, think about recycle, reduce, and reuse. And there are a lot of opportunities for us to kind of save the environment by reducing our carbon footprint from healthcare. And just one example is something that we don't think about all the time, but telehealth is really something that has taken off with the COVID pandemic. And when we think about our patients, they drive so much, and maybe it's less of a problem in New York City, but And in Houston, for example, people drive from vast distances to come and see me in clinic. And we just estimated nationally, if we say each patient who has coronary artery disease may see a clinician once or twice a year, then it would be that just the emission from the car drive, right, to these for these patients, it would be equivalent to 63,000 metric tons of CO2, which is really equivalent to about 75,000 acres of U.S. forests that will be wiped out within 1 year. So think about just driving and think about ways to maybe changing some of the visits to telehealth or phone visits and things like that that can be helpful for the environment. And the same thing was done by another group that looked at what is the impact of telemonitoring of ICD devices and pacemakers on carbon footprint, and just that move from printing papers and having an in-person interrogation of devices could save significant amount of money, but also could save a lot of carbon footprint that would be equivalent to 14,000 acres of US forest saved. All right, just last few slides on societal impact. When we think about society, we think about energy, food systems, but also how do we change lifestyle using some urban design, governmental policy changes, and healthcare organizations. How can we utilize, how can healthcare organizations have an impact on risk prediction and climate education, and whether it's medical school or residency or GME and things like that, and also ecosystems. So just to give you a concrete example, in Europe, there's a lot of these heart healthy cities where are really a super block model where we move from this is familiar to a lot of you, which is what we have in the United States, but how can we move to a super block model where we have protection and a block where there are no cars, no emissions from cars, we have green space, we have activity, we have walkability, and some of these things that can really help promote healthy lifestyle that can reduce cardiovascular disease. So just to tell you that there is a significant impact from urban design, and this goes beyond clinical care. This is urban designers, and how can we put health and put the environment at the center of designs of cities of the future. Healthy, sustainable food systems are very, very critical. I'm not going to get into that, but there is a really nice statement from the AHA that was published in 2019 that shows that this is important. Policies are very important, but not all policies are helpful or systems are helpful. We showed recently that if you think about AQI, air quality index, these are alerts that you get on your phone sometimes or sometimes on your computer, and that tells you that, oh, air quality is bad, stay indoor, do this, do that, do this. In reality, this was designed using, without evidence base. And what we show is that if you just follow this for the public, first of all, you get alarm fatigue. Second of all, even if everybody follows it, right, you need 3.8 million people that, and this is using the high estimate, meaning that people are more, they're more followers of the AQI, they're more intensive following of the AQI. You get between 3 or 4 million to 8 million is the number needed to treat to prevent one heart attack event, which is really not, this is not something that is going to happen, right? I mean, you're going to have a lot of AQI events, a lot of issues, and so on and so forth that may be not impactful. But what is impactful is if you move to a high-risk population. So in our patient populations, let's say patients who experienced an MI or heart failure in the past 3 months, if you follow the AQI rules, then the number needed to treat is not that bad. And this is from a public health, this is not that bad. It's 1,800 patients. And if you have a high pulmonary event, it's about 900 patients. So the number needed to treat to prevent one event, and this is, again, these are numbers needed to treat, not like medicines or drugs, because this is a free, it's an advice, right? So this is not an intervention that you're doing. But just thinking about this, if you go through a hazardous, perhaps this is what we need to focus on. Patients who are either very unhealthy through very unhealthy days or hazardous days, the number needed to treat becomes reasonable if you follow patients who are at significant risk. So this is just an advice to think about reiterating some of these for our patients using the AQI framework that may be impactful at the long-term and population health. And just to touch upon policies, as you are aware, the Inflation Reduction Act had some climate penalties and climate incentives to improve carbon footprint. And we were interested in understanding how would this, if we were to follow this, if things really happen as they're advertised, and even if they're 50%, right, 50% following of the IRA targets, what would happen to health by 2050? And does that impact health justice or kind of environmental justice? And what we find is that there is a significant number of avoided heart attacks, asthma impacts, and you can say that there is probably 41,000 non-fatal heart attacks that will be avoided, about 19,000 avoided other hospital admissions, lost work days, and so on and so forth. So just a policy that is not intended for health, right, will probably have a significant impact on health outcomes that are beneficial. Not only that, we actually see that this may impact health inequities as well. So you can see that the major group that, the majority of the marginalized communities, for example, Black individuals, have a significantly lower impact or significantly more significant change, more significant reductions in mortality as compared with white individuals. So this may actually a climate policy or climate kind of intervention at the national level may have a significant impact on reducing the health disparities gap that we see. So in conclusion, hopefully I convinced you that neighborhood factors and the exposome have significant impact on cardiometabolic health. The physical environment also has an essential role in promoting or hindering healthy lifestyles. We hopefully convinced you that understanding the environmental impact is critical for our patients, specifically those who have pre-existing conditions, patients that we treat in the clinic as cardiologists. And we hope to have a metric to measure residual risk, both from an environmental and social, and intervene upon that. Emerging evidence also supports that the urban environment as a built environment, smart city design also can impact health. And we really have to think about healthcare as a part of the entire environment. So there's complex loops, but we have to think about the concept of this one health concept where we, the planet, the animals, the plants, and everybody is really living in the same planet, and everything impacts everything. And then we have policy interventions and urban planning are required to cooperate to create healthy neighborhoods. So what do? The path forward. Patients, we need to reduce carbon footprints. We need to utilize N95 portable air cleaners specifically for high-risk patients in high-risk neighborhoods or environments. For clinicians, we really need to start to think about assessing environmental hazards. Advocate for, beyond the clinic, we advocate for environmental health policies, healthcare sustainability in our organizations. From a healthcare perspective, we need to reduce weight and improve sustainability, but also we need to invest in closing the gap in terms of racial disparities in healthcare, invest in prevention, and maybe think about sustainability and carbon footprint as a quality metric. And there is an ACC move as well to establish that. There's a working group from the ACC to do this. From a society, we need to invest in clean energy, but also need to reduce fossil fuel dependence and improve health outcomes through the lens of city design and urban design. But all of us, we really need to recognize our shared responsibility, and even small things by putting the plastic cup or in a recyclable bin is probably going to lead to, especially when you do this at the national level, that leads to significant impact. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alkin. That was amazing, and you're really pushing the field of prevention forward into a whole new realm. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll go through them. And you'll see there now the code for the CME. So I'll start with one question, and then we'll go through the QA. So the prevent, now the equation has incorporated the social deprivation index, right, as a factor, and So that's probably a good move on this. And what are your thoughts in the race exclusion from this? Because you've talked that the social deprivation can affect according to race differently, and we know that we're trying to avoid labeling from races, but what are your thoughts on that, on the interaction of deprivation and race and the prevent equation?
Yeah, very good. So I think the key here is really to move away from race because it's a social construct, right? And the things that we label by race and adjust for race, and this is not just a move from the AHA, but you can see the same thing in GFR calculation. You see this from different societies. So I think this is an excellent move. The key is really to not just remove it and stop there, but really we need to understand social determinants of health. We need to understand environmental determinants of health as, what can explain that gap, because we need to incorporate this into our risk prediction, right? There's no surprise, when you take a look at the data, paper after paper, study after study showed that if you take a look at any cardiovascular health outcome, Black individuals, for example, in the United States, have higher risk compared with white individuals, okay? When you take the race out of that equation and not replace it with anything else, then you are not capturing that risk, right? You're not capturing the risk that's associated, and that would lead to reducing, uh, uh, prevention strategies. For example, if we want to take a look into the prediction of ACVD risk, right? That will lead to worsening and broadening healthcare gaps that would lead to significant adverse events in individuals that are already marginalized. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I agree with the move to move away from race, but at the same time, we really need to invest time and effort into understanding social determinants of health. And this is difficult because just looking at SDI, first of all, the American Heart Association Prevent model does not mandate the use of SDI, right? There is an optional SDI that is included. And for logistic reasons, that's important. But at the same time, SDI is not the best metric. SDI was not developed for health, right? It's not developed for cardiovascular health. It's not so there are a lot of other things that we need to look into. And an example of what I showed you on using Google Street View images and things like that, that are broadly available, that can be translated into a more refined metric that can capture that gap so that we can have an equitable prediction, right? That's the key. I think just moving away from race is important, true, but removing race, then it will lead to an inequitable prediction of events. And there's a lot of studies that showed that pooled cohort equation, a Framingham risk equation, really underperforms and underestimates risk in individuals who are living in high poverty neighborhoods, while it overestimates risk in individuals who live in affluent neighborhoods. So, because obviously it's derived from cohorts that we have no idea where people live. And again, I think we need to invest in healthcare strategies, but also healthcare data. And similar to what you're doing in your institution, kind of looking at what is really available to us that we can derive a better socio-environmental fingerprint that will lead to an equitable prediction of risk.
Awesome, awesome. Just a comment from Safwan Ghaznavi, one of our imaging fellows that I think you know well. He says, great and thought-provoking talk. Always a pleasure crossing path with you, Dr. Alkindi.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Gazwan.
Okay, so thank you very much for, let's see, if we have one question from Daniel Lorenzati. He says, great lecture, thanks. Is there any data looking at polygenic risk scores that may be determinants of individual environmental vulnerabilities?
Yeah, this is very excellent. And this is actually work that we're doing right now to understand, not only understand the uh, individuals. So polygenic risk scores are probably independent of environment with respect to prediction of cardiovascular disease. And there are some studies that looked at PRSs and environmental risk and showed that they're independent with specific examples of cardiovascular disease. But the key here is really, are there some genetic components that may make you as an individual more susceptible if you're exposed to the same amount of PM2.5 or other environmental variables. And this is something that we're working actively on right now using large data sets, including the UK Biobank, to actually study this specific question. So more to come, hopefully, in the future. I don't know. I don't have the answer to this yet.
Oh, that's very good. Thank you very much. And so hopefully we'll be in touch for collaborations and congratulations on the amazing work.
Thank you for the invitation and look forward to more collaboration.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.